Welcome back to Pin and Reel. I'm your host, Uncle Joel, and today I want to talk about Mark Millar's Space Bandits, with art by Matteo Scalera. So this is set up for a future Netflix series, or maybe even multiple Netflix series. I'm not really sure how it's going to work, with a sci-fi setting that's based off of Mark Millar's work. And if you've seen my review for Sharky, you know that I wasn't really too impressed with it. This book, however, I do feel is a bit better. And part of that, I'm sure, is Matteo Scalera's artwork. He's a much more seasoned artist when it comes to sequential art and comic book art, having really come into his own with his work on Black Science. And so here, I feel like we get a much better representation of the world, and he does a really good job of just creating this vibrant universe that really feels lived in. Now, the main story here isn't really anything to write home about. It's just kind of your basic revenge plot in space. But keeping in mind that this is set up for the Netflix series, I do feel like it does a decent job of at least setting up the characters for where they are. Now, this story really feels kind of like the pilot episode for the show to come. As a comic, it was entertaining enough, but ultimately forgettable. But when I was reading it, I was really able to keep in mind that this is essentially the pilot episode for the forthcoming Netflix series. And so, being able to keep that in mind, I could really appreciate it much more in that light. The character dynamic between the two main characters is nothing you haven't seen before. You've got the really smart person, and then you've got the really good fighter, and they work with each other, and they play off of each other, and each one does their own thing. It's kind of unimaginative, it's kind of unoriginal, but it works, and it's done well, so I'm not really going to knock it for that. There were a few things about the plot that I found fairly predictable, but again, trying to think of it as a pilot and not so much as a comic. As a comic, it is a little bit disappointing to see Mark Millar lean on such tropes and such predictable twists. But even then, despite that, it was still enjoyable enough. There were a lot of interesting locations on display here, but they seemed to jump from them really quickly, and you went from one interesting place to another interesting place, and there was a lot that I would really like to see more of, but you just don't really get to spend much time there, and so it rushes through them very quickly. And that kind of serves to reinforce my perception of this series, in that it's very much more of a world-building pilot episode for the eventual Netflix series, rather than really much focus on telling its own story. And overall, I would say as a comic, it's good, not great, and doesn't really live up to the rest of Mark Millar's work. But as an introduction to the world and a setup for the Netflix series, I think it works well enough. So yeah, it's definitely not as good as a lot of other stuff by Mark Millar, but I would definitely say I enjoyed it much more than Sharky. And speaking of Sharky, I felt right from the first few pages of Space Bandits that this had some sort of connection to Sharky, and was likely set in the same world. And sure enough, at the very end, you have a page that isn't really story connected, but serves to show that the two different comics are connected and take place within the same universe. Whereas I'm really not too interested in seeing Sharky come to Netflix, I do want to see what they wind up doing with Space Bandits. I do feel like there's a lot of solid groundwork here and a lot of solid world building that is going to lead to some very interesting stories, and at least has the potential to make for a very interesting show. So while I haven't heard much about the show just yet, I am looking forward to it, and it is one that I will be checking out. So quick addendum. While editing this video, I found out that both Sharky and Space Bandits are not going to be series, but they're actually going to be Netflix movies. Now, I assume that they're still going to be tying into one another, and there's still the potential for them to build this into a greater universe and have a series of intertwined movies and essentially build the Millarverse as essentially Netflix's version of the MCU. But on that, I do find this comic and Sharky to be a little bit more disappointing, considering that they are not setting up for a new series, but they're setting up for a single movie. Of course, with the potential for sequels, but nevertheless. Now, that being said, I do think both of these are going to work better as movies than they are as comics, so hopefully I'm right on that front. Otherwise, personally, I think I want to set the whole thing out. But if you've read Space Bandits, or if you've read Sharky, or especially if you've read both, let me know what you thought of them down in the comments, and how you feel the eventual Netflix shows are going to be. Yeah, I could see it just being one show that has all the characters in it, or I could see them building their own universe and having multiple different shows based off of Mark Millar's work. What approach would you want them to take? What would you like to see in these shows? Are you even interested in these shows? Sound off in the comments and let me know. If you could help me out and hit like, I'd appreciate it. Hit subscribe so you don't miss any future comic reviews and discussion. And until next time, this is Uncle Joel saying, stay tangible.